and this is the second day of the 33rd Annual Russell B. Clark Gerontology Conference, and we have a wonderful program this morning, and I'm really excited about it. Karina Tanner's from nursing, and she's going to be presenting on Hispanic families as a buffer against social isolation. Alex Jensen of the School of Family Life at BYU will present his research on sibling relationships in adulthood, our longest lasting relationships. And Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad of Psychology and Neuroscience presented last night. She's doing double duty. She's going to present also today on some of her research. And at the end of the presentations, and each will be about 20 to 30 minutes long, then we'll have questions, a question and answer session, a panel. And so we would invite you to hold your questions if you have any until then. Last night after the after our keynote address and when we were having refreshments, a couple of professors from the University of Utah that I invited to come down came up to me and said, "You have really impressive students." And I said, "I know, they're great." And I guess at the table that they were sitting for dinner, they were just very impressed with those particular students and others that they met. And so I wanted to pass that on to you. I think we have the best students in the world. So this is a great place to be and to work. So Karina Tanner is an assistant professor of nursing. She joined the Brigham Young University College of Nursing as an assistant professor in 2019 after completing her PhD and a 2-year National Institutes of Health Research Fellowship in Cancer, Aging, and End of Life. She maintains an ongoing clinical practice at the University of Utah Moran Eye Center, where she has worked since 2011, creating a curriculum designed to help individuals with vision loss maintain their independence and quality of life. She holds postmaster certificates in gerontology, she's an adult nurse practitioner, and she is passionate about guiding students in honoring and fostering late life potential, creating an age-inclusive culture, and changing what it means to be blind. And so, Karina?
I am blind. I'm legally blind. And so you'll see me as I present doing some, if you're one of my nursing students, you've seen this all before, but I'll go back and forth between my phone, my magnifier, and if I really can't see a statistic, one of my fabulous research assistants up here will he's got a microphone ready and he'll read the slide for me. So we're gonna just get the job done. You can see how this looks. I don't look blind. I have peripheral vision. Most people who are blind don't look blind. And so that's good for all of us to be aware of. I want to share with you today a line of research that I'm very excited about, Hispanic familismo. I couldn't get Dr. Merrill to say that. Hispanic familismo as a buffer against social isolation among older adults with sensory impairments. A big thank you to all of my co-authors and my team, especially Dr. Jeremy Jorgensen. We've been partnering on this research since 2020, and all of these individuals with asterisks next to their names are BYU students, and they've been integral and essential to this research. Also, thank you to our funders, including the BYU Gerontology Program, who have funded some of this research. And we have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And now, I'm going to get a little bit theatrical. Let's see here. Yes. Do you hear that concertina? My grandfather used to play the concertina. And this is a reading from our family recipe book. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since the creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe on the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instruction on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies, and the ghosts of lovers. Our ancestors eat with us, and they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror and a place to celebrate the terrible victory. At this table, we sing with joy and with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse, and we give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying and eating the last sweet bite. I want to talk with you today about Hispanic familism. My ancestors were farm workers, and this is my grandfather. It was during onion harvest, and that's me in the red overalls in the onion basket. The term familism or familismo describes a cultural ideology which prioritizes the needs of the family, and it emphasizes strong identification and attachment of individuals with their families, as well as concepts like loyalty, reciprocity, and solidarity among all family members. So today, in the few minutes that I have, we're going to review some shifting demographics in the United States, and I'm going to briefly review this research trajectory and the creation of a new measure of social isolation, which includes family support, talk a little about our current project and where we want to go. Shifting demographics. In 2023, the U.S. population of Hispanics was 62.3 million. That is comprising about 18% of the U.S. population. This is projected to rapidly increase so that by 2060, 28% of the U.S. population is projected to be Hispanic. This is largely owing to births in the United States, not a flood of immigration across the border, but rather births here. The immigration, it represents a small increase in the Hispanic population compared to births of Hispanics that are here. As a point of comparison, in 1960, there were 6.3 million Hispanics living in the United States. Look at that, isn't that amazing? 900,000 of those were foreign born, while 5.4 million were born here in the United States. My ancestors from New Mexico, the border crossed us, yet we preserved that Mexican and Hispanic culture. So we were chopped into the United States. Now, the median age of Hispanics is increasing rapidly. Now, the median age of the entire population, even the global population, is increasing. But for Hispanics, it's actually increasing more rapidly. And we estimate that between 2018 and 2040, the population of older Hispanics will increase by 175%. So we'll see lots of older Hispanics. Okay, and now we're going to shift and we're going to talk about sensory impairments, because when we talk about the aging of the population, we are looking at sensory impairments. All vision impairment increases with age. All of the main causes of vision impairment are either unique to older age or dramatically increase with aging. So where we see in the general US population, about 9% of older adults age 65 and older have a vision impairment. And with hearing impairment, it's even more common, about 31% of those age 60 to 69, and 63% of those who are older than age 70. So that's going to be more than half of everyone. who's going to have a hearing issue, and then dual sensory impairment, that's both vision and hearing impairment, affecting about 11% of the population. Okay, here's some facts about sensory impairments. All sensory impairments increase risk for social isolation. So we can imagine with vision impairment, if you can no longer drive, and maybe even if your vision impairment is severe enough, it's difficult to even walk or get across the street or take public transportation, see what bus stop you're at. Fun fact, I actually waited for a bus in Salt Lake, and the bus came and picked me up, and I got on, and the bus driver said, "Did you know that you were standing next to a bicycle sign?" It wasn't a bus stop, but he saw me there with my white cane, and he picked me up. So even public transportation can be difficult. This can be very socially isolating. With hearing, imagine not being able to hear the music or the conversation or the film or the play. So these can be very socially isolating experiences, and all sensory impairments are associated with cognitive impairment. If you have a sensory impairment, you are at a significantly increased risk of developing a cognitive decline. There are numerous mechanisms that have been proposed as to why there is this association, but it's just a fact. Okay, so let's talk about sensory loss in the Hispanic population. There are disparities. Hispanics are more likely to experience sensory impairment, and the sensory impairment is harder hitting because of healthcare disparities in the diagnosis and treatment of precursors to vision loss like diabetes, but also of vision impairment causing conditions like glaucoma and cataracts. We see that Hispanics have less access to screening. In the Los Angeles Latino Eye Study, 63% of the participants who were visually impaired had never previously been screened or diagnosed with a vision impairment prior to their participation in the study. Also, there is a gap in access to what we call refractive correction. This is regular eyeglasses. Now, many of you know that without your regular eyeglasses, you are rendered visually impaired. So 64% of Hispanics need eyeglasses, and 20% of those who need eyeglasses don't have access to them. In our own research, using the National Health and Aging Trends Study, a large population-based study, we found that 9% of non-Hispanic whites had vision impairment, so that aligns with what we knew about the general population, while in the Hispanic subset, 19% had vision impairment. And then let's look at hearing loss now and hearing impairment. Rates of hearing impairment are similar between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites, with, it looks like about 31% age 60 to 69, and what is it there, Jay, 63? 63% age 70 and older experiencing hearing impairment, but Hispanics will live a greater proportion of their life with a hearing impairment. Some have proposed that this may be due to occupational injury to the hearing mechanism, so exposure to loud noises in factories or road work or construction can cause an earlier onset of that hearing impairment. And the hearing impairment is harder hitting because there is less access to hearing aids in the Hispanic population. Now, when we talk about Hispanic population, we're talking in very general terms. I'm Hispanic and I have a PhD and I have access to health insurance, but in general terms, the Hispanic population has less access to these resources. Again, with the data set we've been working with, National Health and Aging Trends Study, round 1, 16% of non-Hispanic whites reported having hearing impairment, while 22% of Hispanics reported having hearing impairment. So that's not consistent with what we've seen nationally. We do see that Hispanics actually have higher rates of hearing impairment. Okay, our first study in this trajectory wasn't about Hispanics at all. We were actually interested in looking at these relationships between sensory impairments and cognitive decline, and whether or not social isolation is a mechanism in these relationships, if perhaps the sensory impairment could lead to social isolation, and then that downstream could compound the risk for cognitive decline. And we did find that concurrently and longitudinally, social isolation was a significant mechanism in this relationship between sensory impairments and cognitive decline. So this is great because this helps us to identify an intervention target. If social isolation is partly explaining why people are becoming cognitively declined as they age with sensory impairments, we can maybe target this, as Dr. Holt Lundstedt is working on, these interventions to improve social support. But we pulled out a Hispanic subset from the study, and the Hispanic subset appeared to be very socially isolated, more socially isolated than their non-Hispanic peers. And we thought, how could that be? Because Hispanics, we know they live in these big intergenerational, multi-generational families. In fact, 27% of Hispanics are multi-generational. That's with at least 2 adult generations above children that are age 25 and older. And comparatively, about 16% of non-Hispanic households were multi-generational. And it's even higher for those Hispanics who are foreign-born. About 50% live in multi-generational households. I'm like, how can you be socially isolated if you have this big family? Is this family providing a type of social support for you? And so we had a BYU student, research assistant, who said, how are we measuring social isolation in the data set? Maybe there's a cultural disconnect between what we're calling social connection and how Hispanic families are making social connections. So this was the measure we were using. We love the work of Dr. Cudjoe. We think he's done great work with this data set and creating this measure. Now, many of you who have worked with pre-existing data sets, large population studies, know that you are limited to the information that's in the data set. You can't just create your own dream measure. So these are the elements we pulled out of the data set to measure social isolation. And down here, okay, I'll just go through them really quickly. Do you live alone? In the last year, have you had 1 or fewer people to talk about important things with? And in the last month, have you attended religious services? In the last month, have you participated in clubs, classes, or other outside activities? Or in the last month, have you done volunteer work? And this student, she also comes from a very familistic culture. She's like, these aren't ways that we meet our social needs by volunteering in the community, or maybe you are volunteering in the community, but you don't call it that. Maybe you're watching your cousins, and that's volunteering in the community, babysitting your cousins. Or taking clubs or classes. There could even be some discrimination or some language barriers preventing Hispanics from participating in clubs and classes and other things in the communities. So here's a great quote that kind of underscores the direction we were going with these measures. So when we pick a measure for social isolation, they reflect the cultural-based worldview of those individuals who are doing the research, including their perceptions, their norms, their values, and biases. We must build our research on the concepts that reflect the experience of the research participants. So we thought maybe there's another way, still working with this existing data set, that we can reflect the Hispanic experience of meeting social needs. So we took out the last 2 items from the measure and we replaced them with, in the last month, have you visited with, in person, with someone, a friend or family in your home or their home? And do you live in a multi-generational household? And then we published it. We said, hey, we changed the measure. Oh, we published that. But we didn't do anything with it. But then we did. Then we repeated the first study with Hispanics, and again, we looked to see if social isolation was a mechanism in this relationship between sensory impairments and cognitive decline. And what did we find? Well, I might need my notes. Just a second here. So we looked to see if there was a relationship between sensory impairments. So research question 1, as seen in the purple box, we wondered how sensory disabilities related to social isolation. And we found that vision and hearing disability were not related to social isolation concurrently or longitudinally when we used this new measure, which included family support. That's a non-finding. That is a finding. These sensory disabilities should have been associated with social isolation. They always had been in the past, but when we include that measure of family support, they weren't related to social isolation. As seen in the green box, our second question was, how do sensory disabilities relate to cognitive functioning? And we found that, yep, vision impairment especially was associated with one of the measures of cognitive decline. So we still have that relationship there, unfortunately. But as I said before, there are many mechanisms why vision disability may lead to cognitive decline. One reason is that they have a common cause, a common underlying cause. So now, let's see here. Okay, and then for number 3, research question number 3 in the light blue box, our third question was, what is the relationship between social isolation and cognitive functioning? And we found yes, as truckloads of other studies have indicated, and Dr. Holt-Lunstad could corroborate this, social isolation is related to cognitive decline. It is associated with the cognitive decline. But then finally, this is the big crux of our first study, is social isolation a mechanism connecting sensory disabilities to cognitive decline? Another significant non-finding. There was no direct associations that were significant for vision disability or hearing disability predicting cognitive functioning through social isolation. So we see this, what we are calling a buffering effect of these family social connections. So our current project, we are going to compare Native Mexican older adults with sensory impairments with Hispanics in the US and non-Hispanic whites in the US. We're using the Health and Retirement Study data and the Mexican Health and Aging Study, MHAS data. And our preliminary findings, hot off the presses. Ask Gina and Jace, my research assistants, and Jeremy, are you here? Is Jeremy here? Okay. Hot off the presses. Vision, this is significant, I feel like. It corroborates what we suspected. Vision and hearing difficulty rates were much higher among Mexican and US Hispanic individuals compared to US non-Hispanics. We have to do something about this. With my work at the Mirandas gets me really fired up and really excited. We need to do outreach here. Among US non-Hispanics, sensory difficulty contributes to social isolation to a greater extent than it does for Hispanics. And in general, social isolation was greater among the non-Hispanic individuals. So we do believe that this familism is protective, that it should be valued and cherished, not just for the delicious food and the fun company around the table, but it's very protective of health, especially among individuals with sensory disabilities. What we'd really like to do is do some interviews with Hispanic families where an older member of the family has a sensory disability and learn some of the ways that they are providing support for that individual, or as a care partnership, what is the individual feels needed and useful in their family structure, even living with a disability. So we'd love to get at some of those qualitative dynamics. Dr. Holt-Lunstad talked about the difference between social isolation and loneliness, with social isolation being the number of connections you have, the opportunities for connection you have, but loneliness being the subjective experience. So we'd like to see if with these social connections associated with familismo, multi-generational living, if it's also a buffer against loneliness. We really need to improve measurement in our large population-based data sets, so we'd like to advocate for that. That's why we published the piece about how we had adapted the measurement. And Hispanics and other minorities are underrepresented in these large population-based data sets, and so we want to advocate for and do what we can to improve recruitment of minorities into these large panel studies.
Alex Jensen's going to be our next speaker. He is an associate professor of human development in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University. His research focuses on exploring the dynamics of sibling relationships in adulthood, with a keen focus on understanding the ways in which individuals provide support and care for each other within these relationships. Dr. Jensen earned his BS in Marriage, Family, and Human Development from Brigham Young University in 2009, followed by an MS in Child Development and Family Studies from Purdue University in 2011. He went on to complete his PhD in Human Development and Family Studies at Purdue University in 2013. He then went on and did a postdoc at Pennsylvania State University, and then he came and joined the BYU faculty in 2014. So welcome, and thanks for coming.
See all of you here today to talk about siblings, a topic that I think we just don't talk enough about. So we've got 4 questions that I'm hoping over the next 20-30 minutes we're going to get some answers to these. The first is, why are siblings important? Second, how do the sibling relationships change into and through adulthood? And then when we think about aging and later life, how can siblings help us, and also how can they harm us? So I want to start off with a little participation here. So I'm going to define sibling relationships as anybody you are biologically or legally related to, although we're going to leave siblings in law out of this. So full siblings, half siblings, step siblings. If you're willing to participate, by a show of hands, how many of you do not have any siblings? About 1, more than I was expecting. So I've asked this question to about 1,000 of my students over the last decade, and I've had 2 raise their hands. This is a little bit surprising, because when we look nationally, about 80% of people have siblings, and that means about 20% don't. However, we're in a little bit of a different cultural context here. Thinking of siblings, my older brother and his colleagues at the Marriott School a few years ago collected some data on BYU students. They had about 7,000 in their sample, and 99.12% of BYU students in their sample had at least 1 sibling. That kind of matches with what we're seeing today. So with that first question, why do sibling relationships matter? Well, on one hand, it's because most of us have them, and they're around. The answer to this, or the second answer to that question, is that siblings are going to be with us for a long time. We often say that they are our longest lasting social relationships. So I want to put some numbers on that to help us kind of picture what I mean. So let's imagine a scenario where you've got an individual who becomes a parent when they are 25 years old. So now they've got that firstborn child, and then 3 years later they have another child. So those 2 siblings are 3 years apart. Now, sticking with that firstborn, let's imagine that they then meet the person, a spouse, that they're going to marry when they're 25 years old, and then let's say that couple has a child when they're 30. All right, 2 more numbers, at least 2 more numbers here to throw on here. So let's say that initial parent passes away when they're 75, and then that firstborn also passes away when they're 75. Okay, so we've got this whole family situation here. That firstborn and that secondborn, their relationship in this scenario lasted for 72 years. That firstborn's relationship with their parent and with their spouse only lasted 50 years, meaning, at least in mortality, the sibling relationship lasted 44% longer than any of their other potential social relationships. Now, we're leaving friends out of this that they could have made when they were really little. And obviously, there's going to be variation in this. Not everybody's situation matches this. But for most of us who have siblings, our sibling relationships will last much longer than any other relationship. So why do siblings matter? Most of us have them, and they're going to be around for a long time. Makes me want to give my sister a call, see how she's doing. So given how important siblings can be, surely we know a lot about sibling relationships and dynamics in the research. About a decade ago, some of my colleagues were publishing a review article, and they wanted to highlight a point. And so they had them and their students went to psychological and sociological journals, and they went and counted the number of studies over a 20-year period on a number of different topics and different relationships. So in that 20-year span, they found about 34,000 studies on parenting. They found about 8,700 on marriage, about 5,000 on peers. As you can tell, these numbers are getting smaller. And they found 741 on sibling relationships. Not much at all. In fact, if you look at those parenting studies, more than double the number of studies on parenting per year than on siblings in a 20-year span. I'd like to say that over the last decade, those numbers have increased a lot, but sadly they have not. So everything I'm going to share today is based in research, but a little bit of a caveat that as sibling researchers, we always say we just don't know much about sibling relationships, and numbers like this are a big reason why we say that. So if we're going to understand siblings in later life, it's important to understand where they've been in the past and how sibling relationships changed over time. This is a picture of my sister and myself when I was a little baby. And this picture to me highlights an important point about sibling relationships, period, but especially in childhood and adolescence. My sister was the youngest child until I came along. When she found out my parents were expecting another child, she said, "If it's not a sister, I'm going to punch it in the stomach." She was disappointed. She's a nice kid, so she didn't actually punch me. But the point is, she didn't have any choice in getting another brother. She didn't have any choice in me being her sibling, regardless, right, of her choices. The fact that we grew up together, we lived in the same household, at least for some of our childhood, we had no bearing on that either, right? It was just a reality of us being born into the same family. Now, when you move into adulthood, the fact that your siblings exist is still not your choice. But you have more of a choice in what your relationship looks like. You can choose to live with them or not, at least in most cases. You can choose to have contact or to have a relationship. So as you move into adulthood, choice and life circumstances of your own choices play a much bigger role in what your sibling relationships are like versus when you were much younger. So when we look at nationally representative data, with children and adolescents, just under 80% of kids live with a sibling, and not surprisingly, those numbers plummet when we get into adulthood. In young adulthood or emerging adulthood, about a quarter of them, and then it just goes down dramatically from there. If we're looking in just raw numbers, at 65 and older, only about 250,000 Americans currently live with a sibling, versus about 58 million who don't. So living with a sibling is much less likely, and some of that is choice, right, and life circumstances. So thinking about, right, moving through adulthood, the fact that I don't live with my siblings for myself has to do with that I am married and I have children. And working in a career and those kind of things often pull us away from our sibling relationships and make them less of a central focus of our daily lives compared to when we were younger. So it's fair to ask then the question, do siblings really matter for adults if they're not forced to live with them like they did in childhood and adolescence? Some data from some other colleagues that they published have suggested that there's kind of this curvilinear pattern in terms of how central or how important siblings are in our lives, that as we leave adolescence and move into adulthood, they become less of a central focus. But as you get to, especially around retirement age and maybe late 50s, as their own children are growing up and moving out, and as people retire, that gives some space that allows siblings to then become more important for older adults than they were perhaps in midlife or earlier adulthood. So this is some data from a study we collected a few years ago, just looking at how frequently people have contact with their siblings. And on average, right, we're looking at monthly to a few times a month, but we see around age 65 a bump. Going in line with that is people's lives change, They transition perhaps out of work and their own kids are growing up. They have some more time, some more space. Siblings become, again, a more central focus in their life. At least you have more time to have contact with them than you did earlier in adulthood. These averages, though, they do kind of mask a lot of variation in what's going on in sibling contact in mid to later life. So if you break down into the different categories of how frequently people are contacting their siblings, there's a lot of variation. Kind of grouping those together, about 57% of people in mid to later life have contact with their siblings at least monthly. The 10% at the bottom will always interest me, about 10% of people saying that they never have contact with their sibling. In the same data set, we also asked people how frequently they wanted to have contact with their sibling. And that number is quite a bit higher, about 73% saying, I want to have contact at least monthly. Still about 10% saying they never want to have contact. We haven't done this study yet, but one of these days we'll get around to it, trying to figure out who are those people that don't want any contact with their siblings, what's going on there. I would also be interested to dive into kind of this mismatch, because of those 48% who never have contact with their sibling, almost half of them don't want contact. But of the people who never have contact with their sibling, about 28% of them want contact regularly. So I'd be interested to see what's going on there too. So moving then right here into later life, how can they impact our well-being as we age? There are parts where they can harm us, there are parts where they can help us. So on one hand, for the worse, sibling conflict is not linked to good outcomes. It's linked to more depression, more loneliness. And we see very similar patterns here if we looked in younger adulthood, adolescence, childhood. Having lots of conflict with a sibling generally is not a healthy thing. On the other side, having a more close and supportive relationship is linked to better outcomes, like less loneliness, or having more contact in later life helps people to have greater life satisfaction. We see very similar patterns of that also, again, at younger ages. But those findings there are they're very simplistic, right? Very straightforward. You have a good relationship with somebody, they support you, it tends to help your well-being. But with siblings, things become more complicated. So if we're going to understand some of that more complication in later life, it's helpful to understand earlier in life how siblings, some of the ways they can impact us and the way they can shape us. As sibling researchers, we tend to define the way siblings influence each other into two broad categories. We call them direct influences and indirect. So direct influences are things like the actual interactions we have with each other, the way you get along, the way you fight with each other, those kind of things. We call them, or look also at social learning and differentiation. So this is looking at your sibling as a model for maybe somebody you want to be like or somebody you don't want to be like. And sometimes the same sibling in both of those processes. But then we also look at indirect influences. And this is how a sibling might shape broader family dynamics and sometimes parenting and how that might impact individuals. So one of the most ways siblings have been researched in the past is how they dilute family resources. And the general idea is that if you add more kids to the family, it makes it so there are fewer resources. People have also studied parental expectations and how maybe older siblings shape expectations for future kids. Then my personal favorite, parental differential treatment, or sometimes called parental favoritism, and how parents treat siblings differently. So we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about how parental differential treatment can make sibling relationships more complex as we get into later life. So when I talk about parental differential treatment and then we think later life, sometimes people say, but they're all grown up. Like, why is this still a question? And the thing about parental differential treatment is it doesn't go away. Or another way to say that is parents' influence on their children doesn't end just because the children have grown up. And I'm using that term children to mean the offspring, but in this case referring to grown up, adult children. And I would add to that it doesn't have to be based in reality. Your perceptions of how you might be parented or treated differently than a sibling ultimately drives a lot of the effects we see versus like what actually happened. I'll share a story to kind of highlight some of that. So a few years ago, a colleague of mine was giving a community presentation, not unlike today, talking about parental differential treatment in later life. At the end of her presentation, this lady came up to her and just said, thank you, thank you. I have to tell you that what you said really resonates with my life experience. So this lady went on to tell her this story. And that growing up, she had felt like she wasn't ever as loved as much as her sister. It was just her and the one sister. And this always just really bothered her growing up. And as she became an adult, right, life kind of went their different ways, but that feeling stuck with her. And as her own mother aged and needed either to move into a home to be taken care of or to live with either her or her sister, the sister didn't want to help take care of the mom. And this lady saw this as a great chance to bring her mom into her home to fix their relationship and maybe change her position as being the unloved sister. So for several years, she took care of her mom every day, provided all the care she needed. And this story is such a sad story. At the very end of her mom's life, literally the day she died, she calls her over, the sister's not even there, and she says, I just have to tell you, I never loved you as much as I loved your sister. And I still don't. And this lady, right, expressing this to my colleague, she's like, this happened over a decade ago, and I think about this every single day. And it haunts me, right, that my mom didn't love me as much as she loved my sister. So I share this story for a couple of reasons. One, it's horrific. and I laugh right out of sadness and awkwardness of sharing that. But two, it highlights how these feelings of how we might be treated differently than our siblings can stick with us. And her story is extreme, for sure. And I would hope it's not the story that most of us have experienced. But then I also share her story because it contrasts with the reality of what most of us experience. So when we talk about parental differential treatment or parental favoritism, we do often think of those extremes like this lady's story. But the reality is that differences in parenting are as diverse or as possible as there are ways that parents can parent or interact with their children. So if they spend more time with one child or another, or they have more conflict with one child than another, or as we get into adulthood, some common things we see is trusting one child to help them more than another, or being more proud of one child than another. All those differences have the potential to impact adults as they age. And a student, we published this paper recently, and she wrote this line in the paper that was just the best I've ever heard this written. She wrote, it's not that children are parented poorly, but that they are treated differently than a sibling. So as we talk about the effects on these next couple slides, I think it's important to keep in mind it's not about necessarily bad parenting, it's just about being treated differently. And when we're treated differently than a sibling, that makes us see through the world differently. If we get the short end of the stick, we often feel then worse about ourselves. Or if we're getting parented better or the favored treatment, for lack of a better word, we tend to feel better about ourselves. So in mid to later life, a handful of studies have consistently shown that those who feel like they are treated less favored by a mother or father, but most of the research is on mothers, they tend to have higher levels of depression, lower life satisfaction, more anxiety, and also poorer physical health. So I wanted a few years ago to take that kind of idea, right, of getting treated less favorably or more favorably than a sibling in later life and see, well, what does that mean in connection with contact with a sibling? Because typically we think contact with a sibling in later life is really helpful, right? It's adding another member to your social support circle and potentially helping you. So we interacted those two things together. And on this chart, as I think about it, Jeremy Jorgensen sitting over here, you were an author on this one too, if I remember right. You got your handprints on everything today. So what we did was we looked at the type of contact people had with their siblings and classified them into different groups. So some people had very little contact. We've already seen some of that data. Some people had average or middle levels of contact. There were some people that only had traditional types of contact. So they were seeing each other in person and also on the phone, but they didn't text, they didn't use social media. But then we had this group that had high levels of contact, and we're often here talking about weekly, and they had contact in lots of different ways. It was social media, they would text each other, they would see each other in person, they would talk on the phone. And what we found was that those who had lots of contact and through all these mediums, if they felt like growing up, so this isn't what's going on in their life right now, because actually a lot of these older adults, their parents had already passed away. If they felt like when they were growing up that their mother didn't parent them or treat them as well as their sibling, they reported much worse physical health. But those who reported that they were parented more favorably than their sibling, they had better physical health. And our takeaway from that was that this may be having this regular contact with a sibling and you feel like you just never got the better parenting, might be this consistent wear on you, and it wears on you over time, which then might be expressed in worse health. On the other hand, if you felt like you were the favored kid, it might be this continual reminder of your favored position in the family, which might help you have better health in the long run. So all that's to say, siblings can help us a lot, but sometimes things are more complex than we initially think. So what, and now what? Like we said, most of us have siblings, and they're going to be there for a long time, and they have the potential to be great sources of social support in later life. But there are cases and situations where it gets more complex, and they have the potential also to be a detriment. So what do we do with that information? For those of us who have siblings, I would say go out and make sure your relationships stay strong. If you've got residual feelings of parental favoritism, differential treatment, work on resolving those. Because you never know, you might need your siblings later in life as you age. Thanks.
So Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad is a professor of psychology and neuroscience and the director of the Social Connection and Health Lab at Brigham Young University. She is also the founding scientific chair and board member of the U.S. Foundation for Social Connection and Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection. Dr. Holt-Lundstad is an international scientific expert whose research focuses on individual and population health effects, biological mechanisms, and effective strategies to mitigate risk and promote protection associated with social connection. Her research has been seminal in the recognition of social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. As the lead scientific editor for U.S. Surgeon General's Advisory and Framework for National Strategy, her work also focuses on translating evidence into practice and policy. As I have looked at Dr. Holt-Lundstad's qualifications, it's intimidating to me. She's done so much. It's just so impressive. And we're really fortunate to have her here along with our other presenters. So thank you again. So Julianne.
Ready to go. Well, thank you. Since I spoke a bit about this last night, I wanted to really take a slightly different direction with my remarks today. And so while it's on the same topic, I'll be talking about social connection as an underappreciated health and medical issue. Today I'm going to be talking about a few studies that have been done with my Social Connections and Health Lab here at BYU, some of the work that has been done with my graduate student, Andy Proctor, and our team of undergraduate students that work in the lab, but how this aligns with some of our national work. And I want to just highlight a couple of my collaborators, Dr. Carla Parasinotto, a geriatrician from UCSF, and Dr. Thomas Cujo from Johns Hopkins. So I want to start off by sharing a somewhat personal experience with you all. I actually lost both of my parents within 17 days of each other in the spring of 2021. The first question is, was it COVID? It was not their direct cause of death, but I suspect that it may be somewhat indirectly related. So, like many families, we tried to protect our parents. And so, despite our desire to be together, they were very isolated. Similarly, doctor visits became very infrequent, and if they did exist, they were very brief. Despite our daily phone calls, because of lack of in-person contact, we failed to recognize the extent to which their health was declining. So my father was physically exhausted. And while it was taking more of an emotional toll on my mother, neither one was able to get much physical activity. My dad was no longer playing tennis and basketball like he loved to do. They weren't necessarily eating very well. And like I said, neither one seemed to be seeing physicians or anyone for that matter. But this lack of activity and eating poorly and frustration seemed like normal responses. Many of us were feeling that way. And so, unfortunately, by the time we realized that my father needed urgent medical attention, it was far too late. He was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, and he passed away 2 weeks later. This is actually my parents holding hands. So my mother, this is my mother, grieving the loss of her husband of nearly 60 years, she was surrounded by other people, family. We now, after the passing of my father, we gathered around her, but she was still profoundly lonely. And sadly, one night, reaching out for him out of habit, she fell out of bed, fracturing her shoulder and hitting her head. She later succumbed to her injuries and passed away 3 days later. This was just 17 days after the passing of my father. Like millions of others, isolation likely contributed to their death, but were never explicitly acknowledged. So we see all over that healthcare professionals, from geriatricians to ER doctors to even pediatricians, are seeing patients with heightened concerns about isolation and loneliness, either in their patients themselves or their patients are concerned about a family member or loved one. And yet, social isolation and loneliness have been seen as primarily personal, private matters that often are not brought up in medical settings. Now, this, of course, with the global pandemic, this brought greater heightened attention, forcing healthcare professionals, public health professionals, governments, and other institutions to reckon with these secondary kinds of effects. But importantly, these secondary effects go beyond just psychological and behavioral health. So I just want to highlight a publication that came out not too long ago. This was a clinical statement and guidelines published by the American Heart Association on the objective and perceived the effects of objective and perceived social isolation on cardiovascular and brain health. If you were at my talk last night, I reviewed a lot of the information. I'll just highlight a few. So one of the things that we find from previous research is that there is very robust scientific evidence, now including multiple meta-analyses, hundreds of prospective studies, including millions of participants, that show that being isolated and lonely increase our risk for earlier death, and being more socially connected reduces our risk for earlier mortality. This graph right here shows benchmarks the magnitude of the effect of social connection indicators, as indicated in the orange bars, relative to other factors that are known to impact risk for earlier mortality. And so in the blue bars are many of the factors that we take quite seriously, in things, including things like smoking, alcohol consumption, vaccines, exercise, BMI, and air pollution. And so we have this very robust evidence of the impacts on earlier mortality. But we also know that lacking social connection, whether through isolation, loneliness, or low social support, has been linked to increased risk for cardiovascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, dementia, susceptibility of cold and flu viruses, and several other medically relevant health outcomes. And so this robust empirical evidence indicates that having fewer and lower quality social relationships has been associated with poorer physical health outcomes, and that more positive associations or positive relationships are associated with better health and higher odds of surviving. But one of the big questions is, to what extent are these risks known, recognized, and addressed? And this is really important. Part of the reason why I did those benchmarking was because this was assumed to be widely under-recognized. And whether that is through the acknowledgement and recognition of the general public, as well as the medical community. And so when we look to what evidence do we have, though, of what public awareness is, there was a study done in 2018 by Alex Haslam and colleagues. And what they did was they surveyed roughly 500 people from the US, UK, and Australia. And what they found was that when they compared the objective effect sizes of what factors are linked to risk, that there is a significant underappreciation of social factors. In fact, the title of their paper was "Social Cure? What Social Cure?" As if people just simply aren't aware of it. So my colleagues and I wondered, well, a lot has changed since, while this was published in 2018, the data was collected in 2017, and a lot has changed since then. So we've seen a lot of public discourse in this area, a lot of attention in the media focused on a loneliness epidemic, so perhaps social awareness has increased due to that. In 2017 or 18, the UK appointed a minister for loneliness. This led to a national health campaign and strategy and awareness campaign. And then here in the United States, we had a National Academies of Science report that I worked on that documented the social isolation and loneliness as medically relevant factors. And then, of course, we also experienced a global pandemic. And so the global population experienced personally, on some level, a significant amount of isolation and loneliness. Whether they felt it personally, they likely felt or knew people who were profoundly affected by this. We also saw increasing trends. I shared this last night, but for those of you who may not have been here, we see over the past 20 years these significant increases in isolation, reductions in engagement with others, including those in your home and family, as well as those outside the home and companionship. And roughly 1 in 2 or half Americans report experiencing loneliness. So not only do we have these kind of formalized efforts to raise awareness, but there may be a larger portion of the population that is experiencing this personally and may be more sensitive to this. So our questions going into this research were really trying to understand whether recent attention on social connection and loneliness may have influenced risk perception, and whether or not these perceptions might be particularly heightened among those who are lonely. So there is some evidence to suggest that individuals who are experiencing profound loneliness may be have heightened sensitivity to social information, and so that this might be more salient to those individuals. So what we did was we collected, there were 2 waves of online data. The first included roughly 1,500 respondents from the US and UK and Australia. And then because we did these large countries, we went back and decided that we needed to have just one nationally representative sample on the U.S., also to, in some ways, dovetail the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory to have some U.S. Data as well. So our final sample consisted of nearly 2,400 respondents from the U.S. and U.K. So remember that the original 2018 sample only had 500 in their sample. So when we went to go look to see to what extent this looked like, were there significant changes since 2018? And what we see is that in the black squares are the 2018 data. The orange or red circles are the 2023 perceived rank. And then the blue circles are the ranked effect sizes. So just in order of 1 through 9. And what we can see is that not a lot has changed since 2018. These are nearly identical. And this was, and we tried to do it as identical in this item to this 2018 study. So looking at how this impacts one's extended life or increased survival. But we extended and went beyond the previous study to also see, well, what if we flipped the question and asked, to what extent does lacking connection increase your risk for earlier mortality? And similarly, we see a significant underappreciation for the social connection factors relative to these other factors. And in fact, low social support was literally ranked dead last as factors that was relevant to our physical health. So we thought, okay, well, perhaps this is because the public sees this issue as an emotional health or mental health issue, but to what extent is this related? So we then asked, well, what is the impact on a variety of kinds of outcomes? And indeed, social connection was, when we looked at the different kinds of outcomes that it might impact, mental health was ranked number 1. So mental and emotional well-being were the top, and dead last were physical health and chronic diseases. This is despite, of course, strong evidence to suggest that this is quite important. So this was important because what this demonstrates is that despite the heightened awareness and discourse, and I'll note that we also even though we've anecdotally seen a lot of increase in public discourse, we also did analysis of online sources and how many articles were published online related to this. And I'm not talking academic articles. I'm talking blogs, news articles, opinion pieces, any kind of social media. And we looked at this and we were able to see significant increases in public engagement across these different platforms. So not only the number of articles being published, but the engagement with those articles. So despite that heightened awareness, and despite explicit and campaigns in the UK, people are continuing to significantly underestimate this issue, and particularly underestimate the influence that it has on our mortality. We follow this up looking at, well, maybe perhaps this is more adequately or accurately perceived among those who have high levels of loneliness. But that persisted even among individuals who reported high levels of loneliness, and remained consistent even when we only looked at those with the most severe levels of loneliness, the highest scores possible on the UCLA loneliness scale. So what this suggests is that it really underscores the need for enhanced public education. And certainly in the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory, we recommended public health education on this, as well as policy efforts to recognize social connection as a crucial determinant of health outcomes. So we next followed this up with, well, that's what the general public thinks. What about healthcare providers? Healthcare providers presumably may be more informed, and this may be perhaps different. So before I show you the results, I just want to note that this is still in preparation. It has not even been submitted for publication yet, although my graduate student recently presented these findings at an academic conference. What we found was that when it comes to healthcare providers, the results are essentially identical. And so this suggests that there's still a long way to go in terms of education, both for the public as well as healthcare education. So I want to put this in context with a piece that I published with my collaborator, Carla Perissinotto, on social isolation and loneliness as medical issues that we published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So one really promising note about this is that this was actually an invited piece. And so the fact that the New England Journal of Medicine saw the importance of this issue and invited a piece on this is quite telling. But we recognize that even when, and I'll share a few more of the data that we received from that healthcare provider survey, but what we found is that in cases where providers did understand this, they reported not knowing what to do about it. So in this piece, we not only present some of the evidence on why this is important to the medical community, but we provide a framework for what providers can do about it. And this was based on our work with the National Academies of Science consensus report on this topic. And so consistent with these, we proposed a framework that we call the EAR framework. So we use the acronym EAR not only to conjure the notion of listening. We wanted something simple, easy to remember, and that could be flexible. And so the E is for educate, A is for assess, and R is for respond. And so this is something that can be implemented within clinical care. It's evidence-based and based on consensus recommendations. And so, and we're also looking for opportunities to test the effectiveness of using this framework in reducing risk. So I'll just share a little bit about this framework. So if we think about E, this is the importance of helping healthcare providers to, just like they may emphasize lifestyle factors in prevention, that there's a need to emphasize the importance of social connection for their patients. So similar to how physical activity is important for their health, social activity is important for their health. This is also important for patients to recognize that when this is lacking, it can carry significant risks to their health. They may not be aware that this can influence their risk for heart disease, their risk for developing dementia, or their risk for developing a cold even. But there's also the need to help patients recognize that, that their social networks can be important in terms of managing their existing conditions. And so there's a wealth of data that has shown how those who are more socially connected have better adherence to medical regimens and have better outcomes. The A of this is assess. And so recognizing that this is an opportunity for healthcare providers to identify people who may be at risk in their clinical setting. This is an important point of care. And so we recognize that physicians might make assumptions about who is lonely, who is isolated, or who may be lacking connection. And so the signs may not always be obvious. In fact, we have evidence and even reports of CEOs reporting that they are lonely, celebrities reporting that they're lonely, and a growing number of physicians themselves who report feeling lonely. And so the National Academies of Science recommend screening everyone rather than making assumptions about who may be struggling or who may be thriving. But some signs to look for are those that may be spending significant time alone, or who have recent changes in their living situation, health, or relationship status. And given that changes in their health status is a risk factor for isolation and loneliness, clearly this is an opportunity for them to identify this and take action before it becomes severe. So as part of this assessment, we need to ensure that this is being assessed appropriately using validated measures, and that we track and that this be documented in the electronic health record. This helps us track progress over time. I just took a screenshot of the LOINC codes. I served as a member of the Gravity Project that helped establish loneliness, isolation, and social support in the electronic health record. This is available in EPIC, the most widely used of those. But there are still important challenges there, as we are recognizing that not all health systems, while it might be available, may have not make that as an option, or their providers may not be aware of that availability. So increased training and awareness is needed on that assessment as well. And then finally, the R is responding, and that this can be a response both within clinical settings and response that could be relevant to outside of clinical settings. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of increased attention towards what's being referred to as social prescribing. This is, I realize my font is not showing up, but social prescribing is a way of linking patients to interventions in one's community to address and provide the resources that are needed. This has grown substantially in other countries and is starting to gain popularity in the United States. The evidence is still in its infancy, but does show some promising opportunities. But we need to be clear that healthcare providers not just refer out, like, okay, I'll just send someone out and let someone else deal with this. Because we actually have evidence that integrating psychosocial support in clinical settings can be beneficial. So in one of my own research studies done with Tim Smith here at BYU, as well as a number of BYU students, we worked on a meta-analysis of 106 randomized controlled trials within clinical settings. And what we found was that patients that were randomly assigned to receive some kind of social support in addition to their standard medical treatment had a 20% increased likelihood of survival compared to controls. And this was a 29% increased likelihood of longer survival time when we looked at hazards ratios. Just to put this into perspective, when we benchmark this relative to other kinds of medical interventions, we see that patients that were provided with some kind of social support intervention, this was as effective in increasing survival as many standard medical interventions, including cardiac rehabilitation, smoking cessation, and lifestyle interventions. So what this suggests is that providing support is as effective as some other medical interventions. And what this also suggests is that there is, this can not only improve their treatment, their survival, but it increases their likelihood of survival. So as we think about, just to kind of summarize that response, this response can be reinforcing the need for social connection, integrating social support among all members of the care team, offering referrals that are tailored to a patient's needs, and again, emphasizing that need to listen so that they understand the patient's needs and the patient's barriers so that they can recommend those that may be most aligned with their needs. And then, of course, reassessing patients regularly to see if there are changes in circumstances and the need to perhaps adjust that response accordingly. So importantly, what the evidence that we do have suggests that providers are not powerless to address social connections within clinical care as what might be perceived. The EAR provides a flexible framework that can be adapted to different kinds of medical settings. And importantly, caring for patients' social needs can improve their treatment outcomes. So when we looked at and looked into more carefully in this provider data, one of the things that came out was that patients, and this is a quote, 82% of patients felt that doctors should address social connectedness in clinical settings, and yet doctors reported there's not enough time. So this seems to be a real mismatch in what patients are wanting and what they're getting in the clinical setting. So this idea of time, because as we recommend this being integrated into clinical care, I need to be very sensitive to the real challenges faced by providers. And to better understand these challenges, one of the things we asked is why they're not, right? And the number one thing that came up over and over again was not enough time. So I highlight one of the quotes from one of our responders who stated, physicians spend 2 hours charting for every hour of patient care. This time would be far better spent on patient care. There's simply not enough time, and if an issue comes up, there's rarely adequate support. So just to unpack that, what this quote reflects is, first off, there's the perception that it detracts from patient care and that it is not patient care. Secondly, the feeling of inadequate resources and support. This is a real challenge as we are seeing that 2/3 of doctors are experiencing burnout. We cannot, of course, burden providers with one more thing to do without adequate training, resources, and support. But I also want to be sensitive also that it's not just important to patients, it's important to providers. And in fact, the U.S. Surgeon General also issued an advisory on addressing healthcare worker burnout. And interestingly, focused on the importance of how social connection needs to be core at strengthening the healthcare system. And this because social connection can enhance job satisfaction, protect against loneliness and isolation, and improve quality patient care. So again, this is part of this larger issue. So I just want to conclude by putting this into context. Since I've collected this data, we now also have recently had the U.S. Surgeon General issue this advisory on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that provides even more attention. And the World Health Organization has just launched a commission on social connection. And so my hope is that some of the statistics that I've shared with you today, that perhaps in a year or two, if I present again, that we will be able to see some significant changes across that as this is clearly needed. Thank you.
Maybe I can start with just a question. What was the type of social support that the physicians did prescribe?
In terms of social prescribing, what often is most widely used are tangible kinds of resources. So people need rides to get to places, providing nutrition. They're often, they can sometimes prescribe them to connect them with groups in the community.
Oftentimes, they are more broadly focused on social determinants of health rather than social connection per se. And so part of what many of the organizations that I'm working with now are really trying to emphasize not only, for instance, the Administration for Community Living, we worked with them to help establish their a national database of interventions, and they've created a network of champions to provide resources for that. Right now, it's a much smaller scale than what we had proposed, as many things are with budgets, but there is hopes to expand that and to be able to link, and I'm having conversations with various other organizations on how to better link the resources and identify which resources and programs have stronger evidence than others, because there are many programs that are out there that have not been evaluated. And so we really need to make sure that if we are investing in some of these programs, that we know that they are effective.
So the book perceived the importance of social connections. Do you think that's mostly because people just don't know what to do about it? How do you improve social connections? Any way about that?
Well, I think as far as the perceptions of risk, that most people just see it as relevant to their emotional well-being and maybe mental health, but really has kind of been seen as like that has to do with your emotions, not necessarily like hard science, physical health. And so there needs to be a lot more education there, because I just don't think that is something that many people recognize. And I consistently, when I talk to people, the conversation often goes back to mental health. Whenever I talk about it, it seems to veer back to mental health. And so I think there needs to be more awareness of some of the biological mechanisms that help link to that. So that I would say would be the big issue. But among medical providers, there also was that perception of, even among the ones that did know of the biological basis of this, there was that concern of just, even if we screen for this, what can we do about it? So in a way, they almost didn't want to screen for it because they were afraid if they identified it, they didn't know what to do with it. And yet there are so many factors that they screen for and are part of routine screening that there aren't good interventions for. And so we have to kind of help providers see this in the context of other factors that they already are screening for, and be more aware of the evidence that does exist.
And one of the two is the providers, if they're scared to say, to ask the lonely person if they're lonely, that opens up a long 20-minute conversation of emotions and lonely, you know, they don't have the time and they don't really want to get into this. I'm like, yeah, some of you know, the RP too, and just find out how are they, you know, and so I kind of wonder if that's part of it, and they don't have time, you know, they work together.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely part of it.
I'd be curious to know from all three who presented today, if you learned anything from the other presenters that sparked an idea that you maybe could follow up on in your own work.
I mean, I have a lot, but I just did all the talking, so I'll let one of you go first.
Okay. I'm married to a primary care provider, and we very much enjoyed your presentation last night, Juliana. And so I guess my remarks would be about, and I'm also a nurse practitioner. I haven't practiced for a while, but as an NP, but that where the rubber meets the road, what are the next steps? I think, at least as far as Boyd's concerned, he really understands the physical pathways and ramifications of loneliness and isolation, but then he doesn't have resources. He doesn't feel that he has resources to refer people to. And so maybe that's where work needs to be done. Intervention, resources, support groups. I don't know, but there has to be a next step. It's good we've identified this. When we understand where the gaps are, then we can start working to fill the gaps in our healthcare system. I loved your work, Alex, on siblings. I was thinking about all my siblings, and I was also, I don't know if this is in line with my research, but I would think that it would be maybe something I might suggest for your research as far as when there are siblings who aren't getting along, looking at childhood trauma. You probably already know. Of course you do. Childhood trauma, big with that one. And it has nothing to do with the siblings themselves. It just has to do with the past and triggers from the past and just escaping that past. Okay.
I'll just add, this isn't necessarily a new one for me, but just reinforcing Karina's presentation, that siblings in the context of different disabilities or different abilities is a really important question. And as we age, how are siblings playing roles in those, right? They may not necessarily be in these multi-generational households in some cases, but what can we do to help support siblings in those kind of situations?
So I loved both of your presentations. You did a fantastic job. And so one of the things aligned with the first talk was I thought a lot about our measurements and ensuring that they're culturally sensitive. And so my work with the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection and the World Health Organization, we are working towards looking at how this impacts across, or how measurement is culturally sensitive. and to what extent we need to reevaluate our measurement. And in fact, Thomas Cujo and I applied for a grant from the National Institute on Aging to host a convening on measurement. And part of it will, if we get the funding, we'll look at this issue of measurement. And I think it also goes along with your talk. First off, I absolutely loved it because I'm one of 6 kids, and interestingly, losing our parents so close together and suddenly feeling like orphans in middle age. We interestingly got very close as siblings, and growing up, my parents always said, friends will come and go, but your siblings, will be your best friends for life. I think sometimes they said that when we were bickering as children to encourage that, but it's really true. We are each other's best friends now. But one of the recognitions that I had in terms of research is it's often not included in the measurement. And really thinking about, as we have these larger discussions around measurement, how critically important it is to include measurement on that. And I appreciated, because I've spent a lot of my career looking at the importance of relationship quality, and so appreciated how that's a complex part of all relationships, including siblings. So I absolutely feel like I can benefit from both of your presentations.
So the question is how our research has changed our perspective on aging. Part of, when I said now what do you do, that's been a big part of it for me. Just personally wanting to make sure I maintain those relationships with my siblings. We've lived all over the country, and so it's very easy in this stage of life for those relationships to drift. But, someday my parents won't be around, and other relationships will come and go. But those siblings, making sure I maintain those ties, and wanting to encourage other people to do the same thing.
Investing in those relationships, whether they be friendships or family relationships, just becomes increasingly important to me the more I learn about them. But with regards to my own perspective on aging, having taught end-of-life care and also nursing care of older adults a few times now, I have really gained this perspective. It's a spiritual perspective, I'll share, not necessarily an academic one, but before we came here, we were immortal. And when we leave here, we will be immortal again. And so this little window of time that we have is the only opportunity that we will have in all of eternity to understand what it means to be mortal. And that comes with the frailties of mortality. And just as we see a tree through the seasons, sprout up as a little sprout and get leafy and then bear fruit and then become dry and wither, barren, cold, brittle, and die, we will physically and spiritually experience what that feels like. It is a treasure. It is go time. I'm not saying that the illnesses and frailties that come with aging necessarily are desirable, but there's incredible value and worth in these experiences that we're having. And so for me, from my perspective, I'm trying to embrace it and really lean into it and feel, now that I have arthritis, when the weather is gloomy, feel it. What does it feel like? It's my only chance to be in a body that is mortal. I think it's a treasure.
I just got to say, I really love that.
Thanks. When I think about how my work has changed my perspective on aging, one initial thing I thought of is one of my collaborators, Carla Persinotto, who I referenced in my remarks. She's a geriatrician, and she often starts her talk by saying, disclosing that she's ageist because she prefers older people. but we talk a lot about just the ageism in society, and I think of there's a quote that has an unknown source that says something to the effect of, "Growing old is a privilege denied to many." And we often think of growing old as this something to dread, but really it truly is a privilege. And in my own work and how it's impacted my view on aging, I would say a lot of my work earlier focused on older adults, and that has somewhat shifted to a life course perspective, because oftentimes it's a lifetime of experiences that influence that quality of life in older age. And the importance of how we need to live our lives now in order to age well, right? Because we don't want to just grow older, we want to thrive. And that compression of mortality, right? Morbidity. Thank you. Morbidity. So mortality is something we all experience, but morbidity, that compression of morbidity is really important, because that can extend the number of good years that we have, not just the number of years that we have. So really, I've gone from really, and this is something that I constantly have to bring up a lot, is because we often focus on the problem. We focus on the negative things. But there's so much that we can focus on the protective and the positive side. And increasing resilience and increasing, so in my work, really emphasizing the importance of social connection rather than just how do we fix isolation and loneliness, but how do we promote social connection to really emphasize the thriving side of this, and how do we age well.
I think one of the reasons why these social connections are so important is because we will take those with us after this life. Sorry, I'm getting so spiritual today, but I can't have these conversations without that perspective. Those investments in those relationships we carry with us later. So it's not just a value and worth in this life. Those investments and those close connections will be of value forever. And I guess the other perspective I would share would be that sometimes we do see death in terms of a failure, a medical failure. And we have to remind ourselves that it is the plan that we die. It's the only way of moving on to the next state of our existence, is that our bodies eventually fail us and break. And that's the plan. It's not a failure. It is the plan. It is the way. I guess the message is to do the best we can while that sacred process is happening. And part of that involves the richness of these social connections and social relationships that are eternal.
Yeah, so the question is about how gender plays a role in sibling dynamics. It definitely does. We consistently see from early childhood into later life that having a sister is linked with more contact, better, closer relationships. I will say, however, though, that most of the measures about sibling relationship or closeness and support were all written by women. And so it's possible that the measures themselves are gendered. But so we do see that from those measures. However, conflict tends to be higher with brothers. And when you put two sisters together, right, that closeness is amplified. You put two brothers together, the conflict is amplified. And then when you have a brother and a sister, it tends to be in the middle. And that doesn't mean, right, that two brothers can't have great relationships, but on the average, we do see those patterns. In terms of then when you bring the parents into this, thinking of parental differential treatment, things get a lot muddier. There's some studies suggesting that fathers favor sons and mothers favor daughters. We have a meta-analysis under review right now, though, that doesn't show that, shows that children don't perceive any differences, boys and girls, in terms of who's favored, and that even continues into adulthood. But when you ask the parents, parents report that they tend to give better treatment to daughters than they do to sons. Yeah, so the sisters drive those connections. Yeah, sisters are much more active in maintaining contact with siblings.
This is for Dr. Holmstead. I'm wondering if you know whether insurance codes get in the way of healthcare providers trying to help with social isolation and loneliness, and if they do, there's anything you can about that.
I'm not a physician or a clinician, so I don't see patients, but so I'm going to try and answer the question as best I can from someone who doesn't actively use it. From what I understand from my colleagues and from my work on the Gravity project, that there are the codes available. So this is built into the SNOMED and ICD-10, which I believe is being updated to ICD-11. So there, from what I understand, again, I'm not a clinician, that this can help with that. And so part of what I think you're referring to is that physicians want to be reimbursed for their time. And if they make referrals, that whatever that referral is, that will be reimbursed by insurance or covered by insurance. There are many payers that are working with various organizations. So there are many services and programs that are covered under Medicare. And so in a way, or are being tested among certain types of like the Medicare Advantage. So there are these things happening, but of course we need more of that in order for this to be implemented more wide scale. And for any clinicians in the room, jump in if if there are any.
You know, one thing we just did, we have a situation in the state of Utah with primary care providers not screening for dementia, not diagnosing dementia, and not referring dementia patients. There's just, maybe it is like a form of ageism, but they're like, you know, this is going to happen. It's fairly common. There's no treatment. So, you know, they just don't screen for it or diagnose it. So we just created a double-sided one-page handout for primary care providers in the state that includes information about why diagnosing is important and why early diagnosis is beneficial. And then we included on the handout the ICD 9 and 10 codes that they would need to bill for doing the screening, because we learned that there's actually a lack of awareness of how to even bill for this service. So who knows, maybe in the future we could send out a one-pager to help physicians recognize the importance and be able to bill for helping with social isolation.
I think we have time for one more question. Or we have two.
I've already asked, so somebody else can.
Sure.
Oh, I was just going to say, going along those lines, I could see there being with our area agency on aging a service that supports older adults that are lonely. But I also like there's a family element that we've been talking about here today. So there could be community answers, there could be family answers. I don't know, I've just been wondering about policies that could potentially encourage family members to be in contact with each other in later years. But those are just thoughts more than anything.
So as Jeremy knows, I've done a little bit of work internationally in Croatia. His question was about policies and things that could help families be engaged. So I've done some work internationally in Croatia, and they have an interesting law that they passed in the last few years that you are legally obligated to provide emotional support for your adult children until they've graduated college, and also for your aging parents. Now, what I've heard from people is they feel like it's a silly law because in their culture, sounds like much like Hispanic culture, they do this already, but they made it a law because they're afraid that they're going to become too Americanized, and they're wanting to preserve that.
Thank you very much. Let's thank our speakers one more time.